Global warming. Touchy topic. Seems to be at the forefront of thought in regards to a lot of the media out there today during this time. So I thought I'd touch up upon it a little bit, I've done a little bit of this touching up upon it in the past, but I wanted to do a little bit more detail work in regards to the painting itself. So, anyways, really, I feel like there's more so a lot more scare tactics that are being thrown around in regards to the green movement. One of the largest foundations of the actual argument is CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and we can actually talk about the degradation of the atmosphere. There's actually a point within like the shielding of the atmosphere of the earth where there's like a hole and an opening and it's actually getting larger, and so that's one thing that people like to cite a lot. The other thing is global temperatures, and the other thing that people like to cite a lot is pollution. And then the other thing that people like to cite a lot is, being one with nature and being one with the earth. And also, I guess, efficiency. So, in regards to all these things, I kind of want to break it down into things that I know and to my actual position in regards to what's going on, and how a lot of these things are actually scare tactics, what really is true in regards to the science, what does the data actually show us. So the data actually does show that there is like an opening in the atmosphere. However, the atmosphere is something which is constantly changing, and this is going to relate to one of my other points as well, and that's the CO2 levels and the global temperature. So the atmosphere is something which is constantly changing, and when you look at the people who are extreme advocates of the green movement and of alternative fuel sources, what we actually find is that the data that they're citing is really short-term data, or it doesn't go that far back in regards to the timeline of the earth. If we go back, far enough, 2,000 years, we don't even have to go extremely far back, like prehistoric. We can go back 2,000 years and we can actually find that the earth itself was at a higher temperature than it is now, relatively, while actually having less pollutants and carbon emissions going into the atmosphere. If you accept the actual, let's say, traditional history of the earth and of the human population, the reason I clarify that is because on YouTube there's so much stuff out there about, once there was a global civilization and they were extremely more advanced than we are today, and they had, high energy devices where literally their buildings were configured like an electrical network, harvesting the powers of the elements in certain configurations in conjunction to the natural world, such as rivers and streams and the atmosphere, and harnessing all these energies and blah 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 blah. So I say conventional history to clarify to anybody who's into that stuff and watching this video. In regards to the conventional history, and anybody who's a scientist that's going around purporting the green movement is going to have to accept the conventional history of man, otherwise they're going to be scoffed at and laughed at anyways. So you kind of have to, if you're going to play by the game, you got to play by the rules. Or, if you're going to play the game, you got to play by the rules, and that's just one of the rules. So if you're telling people one thing, you got to accept what comes with that one thing, and that's this traditional history. And so looking at the actual data now, 2,000 years ago, the data actually supports that the earth was actually warmer relatively to today. So are carbon emissions actually what are causing the earth to warm up? If it was actually warmer during a time when there were literally like no carbon emissions except for people occasionally burning fires. You know what I mean? So anyways, that kind of rules that out. And then if we actually go further back, let's say we go prehistoric, like dinosaur times here. So yeah, if we go back even further than what history shows us to prehistoric times, then the Earth was literally a furnace in comparison to what it was now. That's why reptiles ruled the planet, was because they were ectothermic, and they literally received their heat from their environment, and since it was already hot, they literally didn't need to produce any heat at all, which is why, they were there and why they ruled the planet. So yeah, there's that. Anyways, the only thing that actually kind of concerns me in regards to the green movement that I feel like has a valid base or has a valid basis is the fact that we might be limited in regards to resources. The fact that we might be limited in regards to resources. Like, for example, I think it was Britain, which actually had harvested all of the wood in the surrounding area, or all of the coal. No, it was actually wood. So Britain had actually harvested all of the wood in the surrounding area to heat things with. And that's where coal mining actually originated from. They had to find an alternative source of fuel to heat themselves because literally they had run out of their resource. And it's actually called it's called like ecticide. It's not it. Envirocide, where you're like committing suicide by killing the environment. It's actually more notably studied on island habitats with indigenous peoples, where they weren't able to properly manage the resources at hand, and so they were actually, forced to pretty much either move or they would die. So the only thing that kind of concerns me today is just, the future possibility of, the last tree being cut down, or the fact that, who knows, maybe the oil reserves will actually dwindle up. And at that point in time, society has to move on to another resource. However, the scare tactics being used to actually get people to move on, I think, are just that, scare tactics. They talk about renewable energy, and we can talk about a timescale here because, in the long term, fossil fuels are actually a renewable energy. Where does the fossil fuel actually comes from? It comes from decomposed matter, which is ancient. So the matter which is existent today will be decomposed matter in the future, thereby furthering the creation of fossil fuels in the future. So realistically, it goes along a cycle just like the Earth and everything else. It's polar. It reaches an extreme and then transfers to the other extreme type thing with time, just like the seasons. And is the energy that they're actually purporting today as green renewable energy, is it actually renewable? I mean, think of how much you actually have to mine and dig up and purify to actually create what it is that they're using. It's not so much renewable when you actually think of it that way. They're still going to have to do a lot of mines. They're still going to have to do a lot of things. And it's not like, it's like nuclear energy. It's like, oh yeah, you're creating all this stuff, but then you got to get rid of it somewhere when it dies off. And it's like, you're creating all these batteries and everything like that, but what happens when they go bad? Where do we put them? It's just the same perplexing conundrum. You know what I mean? I think something else that is kind of funny with the green movement is a lot of these things are being said to be, new tech. Well, water wheels and hydroelectric and windmills and things to that extent are literally like the oldest tech of, mechanically harnessing the universe's movement to our own advantage. It's nothing new. What's actually new is, the supposed way of transferring and transforming this energy through things such as batteries and furthering the alteration of mechanical output to actually harness this energy for different uses. That's what's pretty much new. But, to actually advertise it as something as renewable energy is kind of like a misnomer, because like I stated before, you have to mine up, and it's like all this digging and, going into the earth and harvesting elements and manufacturing goods and then disposing of things that it's hardly, any more renewable than kind of what we do today. It may, at the end of the day, leave you with like a less greasy and oily feeling on your skin, right? But that doesn't mean that it's any less toxic or poisonous. So really, to kind of sum it all up, I think that more so scare tactics are being used. If you look at the actual history of the earth in a long-term sense, we're nowhere near the temperatures that the earth has been while still actually housing formidable amounts of life on the planet. With the rise of other atmospheric levels comes the rise of other atmospheric elements, and you have greater oxygen levels and things to that extent. The only problem really is cutting down all of the CO2 sinks, which are the forests. And as the heat increases, historically there have been higher oxygen levels in the atmosphere, and the tropical atmosphere is actually what allowed things to grow so big, and the amount of foliage was able to sustain large populations of things which required the foliage, which allowed predators and other things to grow to immense sizes. And then also the fact that they didn't have to convert a lot of energy towards heating their systems, things like that. Life did exist on the planet in much different environments than there are today, and the planet, not too long ago was extremely different than it is today. So to go around and to say the planet's changing, oh no, and like cause hell to break out in a media frenzy is literally being ignorant to the fact that the planet has been extremely different. It's like these people that are supposed scientists, which makes me really ponder and wonder if there really isn't some huge, conspiracy going on here, trying to purport something as scientific when you're almost having to ignore the scientific facts in the long term to be able to state these short-term relevancies. I mean, more so than anything, I think that it should just be promoted on like an aesthetic value. That's kind of how I am. Like, what do you think we should aesthetically try and mold the world or shape the world into being? Let's create an environment that is aesthetic. Let's not go for the most efficient or effective or anything to that extent. Why don't we actually harness the power of our minds and utilize the energy granted us by the universe, the free will which we have to literally manifest and shape the world around us, to create a world which is beautiful. That's my whole argument. I think this whole, scam of produce, economic growth is really just a pyramid scheme to keep those at the top of the pyramid being able to fly around the world in their supersonic jets, while the rest of us are grounded, I think more than anything, that's really what it is. And, if I had my way, it'd be all about aesthetics, not necessarily efficiency or productivity. Like, it's life, people. We're here to experience joy, happiness, beauty, love. Why don't we actually reflect those values in the world around us? Another thing which really irks my inkle, it's not a saying, but maybe it will be after this video, is the whole nutritional scene, the whole fitness scene, right? The media loves to say, this is what's in, this is what fitness is, this is what nutrition is, you should eat this, eat that. Well, that's another thing that really gets under my skin. I mean, if you're a zoologist, a biologist studying the fitness of animals, and you see an animal, you're taking care of animals, in which you can actually see physically the muscle structures right beneath the skin, without having to do any enteroscopic analysis of the animal. You can literally see all the muscle features, which is what we classify as being fit and healthy today. It's actually very unhealthy. There's a level of fat and other things in which a healthy body actually has. And for the media to go around and be saying that this is actually fit and healthy is a total sham, because it's actually not. It's all about, preconditioning your mind to think what beautiful and aesthetic and sexy is, so that when you see these things, you're biologically induced due to hormonal reactions of, your sex organs and the release of hormones from these organs, to think that that is your goal and the goal of humanity, and that is healthy. Well, realistically, it's not. I'm not saying that fat is healthy either, because obviously there's an equilibrium, which is reached in between the two. So that being said, I want to further dive into the realm of nutrition now. And I'll probably make a video more in-depth on this whole nutrition idea, because I've done a lot of research on it, and I literally have papers worth of, cited works which support and back up what I'm about to say. So, mankind evolved on the planet in many different regions. People are vastly different, even though we only have, on average, a 0.01% difference in genetic material, our DNA structure, right? However, you can see how much a major difference, such a minor difference on the microscopic level, makes on the macroscopic level, right? People are literally different colors and shapes than I am, yet they're the same species. So why is it that we think that everybody should be eating the same thing, and that one diet is the best diet for everybody? It's not, people, because people co-evolved in the habitats which over millennia, that specific population habitated. So literally, the science is called nutritional genetics, and it's based upon the fact that people co-evolved with their food sources, their habitat. And so people across different regions of the planet, the face of the earth, are literally more well-equipped due to survival of the fittest and the evolution of fitness. So people who were more able to digest certain things were fitter in an environment, and they passed on these genes. And eventually we have subpopulations of people, which on the genetic level code proteins differently. So anyways, now fast forward to today, where literally the population is able to transport goods across the other side of the planet. You yourself are able to move and get up and go somewhere else and find yourself in an environment which genetically you may not be the most suited for. Now, technologically, in a lot of ways, we can overcome our genetic inferiority through clothing and through other means of adapting ourselves to the environment, right? Individuals adapt, they don't evolve. That's a scientific principle. Well, anyways, there are some things that you can't adapt for over a life cycle. And this is the genes that you code. We're not to the point yet where we can, literally alter genes of an individual, gene alteration and things to that extent at this moment. But the science is based off of the fact that you yourself might actually code for genes allowing you to more suitably digest certain foods based upon your ancestral genetic makeup and the foods which grew up and co-evolved with your population, your ancestral population. And so the whole science is based upon the fact of, getting a DNA sample, whether it's spit, blood, or a tissue sample from an individual, isolating their genome, and then in comparison with their geographical history, you actually look up the native plants and animals which grew up and habitated the surrounding area in correlation with your geographical ancestry, and you actually assign a food profile to the individual which would be most suitable for the individual based upon their genetic makeup. They're more able to digest the food. Now, in my opinion, this is the future. And it can either be taken one of two ways. I'm all about people's freedom. I'm all about people want to go and, jump off a cliff, like, obviously not that extreme of a, we're getting into some sticky situations here, a sticky wicket. But I'm all about people being able to do what they want, to put it bluntly. And the problem with this information is that, let's say that the healthcare system goes completely social and, everything's regulated. And let's say that your genetic profile is something which is then analyzed, and a specific diet is then pretty much, assigned to you, and you're held accountable for only eating certain things. Otherwise, you're going to lose your health privileges, things to that extent. Well, I'm all about, if anybody wants to get a genetic test done by a private corporation or whatever, which then gives you back your results and tells you which foods your body is most suitable for, then there you go. Anybody that wants to maintain and live the healthiest lifestyle possible and reach the peak possible fitness that they're capable of, then they're going to be able to gain and acquire these results. In such a confusing world like the one that we live in today, where literally, you have people that are mixed with so many different populations across the face of the planet that it's hard to really gauge as to what might be most suited for their body. So a test such as this would really open up the opportunity for anybody who was willing and wanting to reach and achieve maximum results in regards to fitness and health. But like I said, it could be taken the other way, and it could be something which really restricts the population's ability to enjoy the beautiful nature of experiencing different foods and cultures and things to that extent, but that's only something that people do, rarely. You travel and stuff like that and you want to experience other things, but for especially the American population, where it's such a modge-podge of different backgrounds, something like this would be entirely and greatly useful for the population and for especially individuals. One could argue, however, though, that the system of production which is in place today actually contains with it the greatest possibility for advancement in the arts and for the aesthetics of the world, because it actually is the driving force for innovation. I mean, people innovate because they want to make money, and so they need a system in place which is the most efficient in regards to the time in which they spend to innovate and to create. And so that's why, ergo, we see the world that we see today. Even though it's something which in a lot of ways represents the opposing ideal, which I previously stated, it actually contains within it probably the only feasible and realistic way to achieve some portion of that ideal. I had this thought the other day about kind of the ascension of the planet. And within my mind, I have this picture that I want to paint. I really wish that I was a better artist, conveying the images within my mind on paper so that everybody could see what was within. I could express it without, give it life, give it form, give it shape. But it seems as though I'm restricted to using my vocabulary and descriptive words and language to actually try and paint pictures. So I had this thought about ascension and the ascension of the planet. And it correlates to some of the writings in which I've done on mystical growth. Gemstones and crystals and things to that extent are fascinating things. It's amazing that things like that even form in the natural world. And also in our ability to technologically utilize them to have such advanced devices such as, electromagnetically emitting devices such as this cell phone that I'm using to record this, or radio towers and other things to that extent. We use these oscillating crystals to actually have color changing pixels within a liquid screen, LCD, liquid crystal. So anyways, it's all fascinating, but it's just amazing to me that things like that even grow and form. And what's even more amazing is our ability to utilize their functions to actually convey a message, to actually artistically portray what it is that I said earlier, an image, a painting, a portrait, and to utilize them to forward our goals and initiatives, purposes of both pleasure and of business, sometimes both. However, going back upon the thought of the ascension of the planet, I kind of had this, image within my mind of intertwining this mystical growth and actually looking at the planet as a structure which is going through a crystallization towards its own ascension, where it itself becomes something on a higher realm of consciousness and of experience and of, technological feats, where, you look at the structures of crystals and it's this highly arranged or, specifically arranged structure, which is solid, it's solidified, it has, these concentric patterns. And you look at the planet today and it's almost like we're in the beginning stages of this crystallization. You have all of these interconnected roadways and buildings, these structures and towers ascending from the surface of the earth. However, I think that the final step in kind of this crystallization process of the realization of this imagination or this image within my mind is the point in which these two things can, aesthetically, more so than like effectively, I guess, be on the earth, where it's just more aesthetic, less moving parts, less like wires, almost looking to the point of where it's actually a digression from technological advancement, but the technology itself is so advanced that it actually doesn't require much of the technology that we see today, which is actually hindering us from getting over the hump of being something which is an eyesore to being something which is in harmony with the rest of our surroundings. I guess in a lot of ways, I'm actually a fan of the green movement. I think that there's just something that gets under my skin about the majority of the people that are actually behind the movement, that it almost makes me want to like go on the other side of the issue, because I have a problem associating myself with the majority of the people that kind of go around spewing forth garbage out of their mouth, and like just their other persona that they have that I don't like associating with. You know, I myself think that the world would be a better place beautifully and, you know, in other ways if there was less smoke and smog going around and stuff and things to that extent. But, you know, one thing you have to ask and question yourself is how much more enviro-friendly are these other things if we have to mine and manufacture, you know, just as much or more so, maybe, possibly. And I just think that there's a lot of biased information that gets thrown around to try and convince people to go to the other side. You know, a lot of times you see these nuclear reactors and these big old silos emitting smoke and all this other stuff, but, you know, on the picture it kind of looks bad, but do they actually realize that that's just steam? I don't think that people do. They don't realize that that's just steam. That's just water vapor coming out of these those silos and stuff like that. And it's like, you know, stuff like that. And it's like, oh, look at all this crap that's being put into the atmosphere. It's like, no, that's actually not the radioactive part. That's not smog. That's like, that's more clean than what's coming out of, you know, the tailpipe of your car that you drive. But it's just like stuff like that. And then it's like, you know, people bandwagoning that I myself don't want to associate myself with. So it's just like I argue for the other side just for the sake of like trying to like put down and just like pound on the numbskulls that I see that are in association with, you know, the other side. Something else which has recently been on my mind, I watched a video on the Antikythera mechanism, about the people that found it, about the project in regards to analyzing it, dating it, and then actually there have been several reproductions of it which are fully functional to this day. I'm currently watching one, and I'll leave a link to the actual video series of this individual who is rebuilding the Antikythera mechanism himself. The reason I'd like to talk about this device is conventional history tells us a story which in a lot of ways is itself contradictory to what we find when we dig and we dig and we dig in history. Man's history in a lot of ways is something which can be, you know, easily changed. All we have to do is change the mind of the one who tells history. But true history leaves a shockwave. A shockwave which, when led back to the actual cause of the shockwave, tells us a different story. Now, I'm basing this discussion off of the Antikythera mechanism, and most importantly, into the actual complexities of the device itself. Are we to ourselves suppose that the ancient civilization of man was far more primitive than they actually were? And some people might say, well, who cares? Well, the reason it kind of matters is if the conventional story of history is actually different from the true story of history, in that there was an interconnected, you know, peoples globally before the one which we see today, then it would really allow us to question where it is that we are today, and in doing so, rearrange where it is that we go tomorrow. Now, the thing that's odd is that mechanisms of this complexity didn't start showing up until, the late 14th, early 15th centuries. And this device has been dated to around 200 BC. So there's this huge gap between when conventional history associates the introduction into the technological world, things which are comparable in design. Now, if we use a little bit more logic and reason, it's pretty safe to conclude that this would not have been the only device of its kind. Obviously, it's a feat and a marvel of technology, which means that there was a pathway leading up to it. Now, the weird and strange thing is that we don't find anything else which tells us a story of technological advancement. All of a sudden, we just have this piece of technology out of nowhere. And it's almost as if everything which could give us a clue as to how advanced these societies actually were, in regards to things that could lead up to the possibility of this device actually being, are somehow wiped from history. It's like there was an organization whose specific goal was to set out and destroy anything which told a different story other than mankind barely coming into the light in regards to technological advancement and the discovery of such things. It's almost as if the history of the earth has been whitewashed to a certain degree. Now, some other interesting things in relation to this topic would have to be both artistic designs and construction designs worldwide. Something else that I would like to point out is that today, when we have a globally interactive society, and specifically in regards to, let's say, the American population, I did a little bit of research a while back, and I concluded that it was like less than 3% of the actual population that ever actually travels overseas. But that being said, it's pretty much accepted fact, that we live in a globally connected society and that these other places actually exist, when like greater than 97% of the population hasn't even ever traveled outside of the United States. So would it be reasonable to conclude that possibly back in the time previously to this one, in ancient times, that similar amounts of individuals actually traveled, the wealthy, the famous, the royal. And so we actually wouldn't necessarily see this, massive amount of artifacts ranging from peoples to peoples being brought and interconnected throughout the world. But what we would see is an influence of ideas, more so than artifacts. And sure enough, we see striking similarities in building structures and in artwork done. However, that being said, it's almost as if each civilization has their own little, spin-off as to how to characterize what it is that we're talking about. Now, looking at things from a different perspective, you could say that it's coincidence. You could say that this is just how things are done, and kind of due to Occam's razor, it's the way that if a society and civilization is allowed to progress independently on its own, then it would naturally travel this route. When you actually start to look at the vast majority of similarities and possible influences, however, it seems to be that this wouldn't be the case, and Occam's razor almost fails inevitably because the chances are way too slim, and there must have been some sort of global influence or something to that extent. Now, to say that, everybody during these times we're traveling, I'm just making a comparison relative to today, that in today's society, not even that many people actually travel internationally. Sure, sometimes people travel from state to state, or, if you're in the European Union or whatever, from country to country, but that's pretty much comparable to state. So, given that, is it too hard to fathom that, we wouldn't necessarily see the archaeological evidence concretely pointing to the fact that people were traveling internationally? There was a global civilization. But it's just a little hard to fathom that people could actually construct things to the extent in which they did, but they couldn't travel across an ocean that would take them, 40 days or whatever, what have you, to travel across. With the precision, and I'm not saying that they didn't necessarily use what we would consider to be primitive techniques. Primitive is something which is relative when you actually get into the boundaries of aesthetics. I think in a lot of ways there are people that are advanced today, but they do things in a way which many people would call primitive, but it's mainly due to opinion rather than technological advancement. Even today we have people living as Amish and things to that extent. And there are different societies and civilizations, and even some very wealthy individuals who choose to live certain lifestyles because they feel as though it allows them to experience the joys of life better. And so who's to say that, these weren't very bright individuals and societies and civilizations who merely chose to architecturalize their societies based upon aesthetic values rather than more so technological ones. Because we see in their structures and in, other remaining artifacts which pinpoint to highly advanced individuals capable of thought beyond the majority of those who actually exist today, is it too hard to fathom that they were capable of much more than we actually give them credit for? Now, that being said, why is it not accepted if we actually use logic and reason to come to these conclusions, that it's widely accepted that there's, that they were a globally connected people and things to that extent? I think that there's a couple possible reasons. One is related to the story of the fall of the Titans, and it has to do with generational ego. Every generation growing up throughout the history of mankind likes to think that it itself is the pinnacle, the peak, type thing. And so to accept in any way, shape, or form that peoples before you might have actually been as advanced as you is kind of contradictory to this generational ego. And so to think that ancient civilizations might have actually been, to the point in thought and in practice of certain aspects of knowledge comparable to us today is in a lot of ways not consistent with what people's egos would like to think. It's like, looking at your parents and not wanting to identify with them to a certain degree. Or the teenagers and everybody in the upcoming generations thinking that these old fogies are old fogies, not anything they want to associate with, and so they kind of form their own group against the Titans, so to speak, until they overthrow them or whatever. So that's a possibility. The other possibility is that literally people just don't really care, and the evidence is pointing to it, but due to the fact that we're able to actually communicate broadly now today after whatever happened which disallowed us to do it in the past, we're just barely finding out this evidence. And even though there's an overwhelming and staggering amount of evidence, everything from tobacco being discovered to, in Chinese mummies and things to that extent, which is like, wait, tobacco's native to the Americas, and, similarities between Peruvian artwork and Chinese artwork and sculptures and stuff like that, that it's easy to dismiss because people say, well, why does it even matter? Even if this is true, even if these structures were for much more of a grand purpose than we give them credit to be for, I think that in a lot of ways, everybody just kind of wants to, whatever, like, let me go home and have my cheeseburger and watch like Pawn Stars or what have you. You know what I mean? So there's that. And then the third option is kind of like what I stated before, that there's like some cover up to somehow maintain control of this intelligence, right? Intelligence is something which is passed on from generation to generation, mainly in the form of writing, sometimes through verbal or oratorial histories, verbal histories. And it's almost as if the people which control this ebb and flow of knowledge, were to maintain control over it, and let's say that it was intercorrelated with specific family lines, and they were to somehow hide behind the shadows and puppet the world, then they would literally be able to wander and travel around the world at their whims and desires, while the rest of us had to work, and everything was free to them, but we all had to pay for it, type thing. Literal vampires, if you will. So yeah, just kind of wandering around thought and recording it for anybody's listening pleasure.